Hi, I'm William Clive from RiskWise Consulting. I'm going to give you a short talk on how to complete a risk assessment focusing on the construction industry. The risk assessment I'm about to use is available on riskwiseconsulting.co.uk for you to download and use. So this is the basic risk assessment that I've just set up. You can see in the corner that you have the details for the risk assessment, a risk assessment matrix, which I'll go through in a bit more detail. You've got the tasks and activities that you're involved with, the hazards with those tasks, who may be harmed, the risk levels, the control measures you're going to put in place, and the new risk levels. There are a number of different stages to setting up a risk assessment. The first one is to identify the hazards. Do this by walking around your place of work, talking to the people involved with the work, checking the internet for resources, and also reviewing the job. For these purposes, I've used a fictional example. It's the demolition of a wall. For example, I've used the work to be done off a scaffold, cleaning of materials, and use of mechanical hammer as my main areas, and you can see the hazards that I've put down here. The next step is to consider who's at risk. There could be a number of different people who are at risk on a construction site. Consider the public first of all. They're most important to consider. Operatives completing the task, of course. Visitors, so people coming to site that might not know the site so well, maybe at particular risk. Young workers are very important to consider. Other site workers, those that may be disabled or are less able, migrant workers who may not understand the rules. So I've just added a list of people that are likely to be affected by the works. You have the operatives, you have the other operatives on site, so the operatives working on the site, and then these are usually people working close to the area, so in this situation the general public isn't considered to be at risk. Okay, so now we need to consider the risk level, evaluate the risk. It's important to remember that risk is a factor of the likelihood by the severity. So when considering risk, it's important to consider the likelihood of it happening, and if it did happen, the severity. First, assess the risk as you find it for each of the tasks identified. Remember to consider both likelihood and severity, as I said above. There is no wrong or right way. It is your assessment, but you may be called to justify this. Back on the risk assessment, you can see I've got the severity and the likelihood. So the likelihood going from very unlikely to very likely, the severity from near miss to sort of fatality. Again, as I said earlier, it's a bit of a subjective assessment as to where the risk is placed in this, but again, that's up to you to decide. You just need to justify it to yourself. So here's an example of some of the ones I've done myself. I consider the fall from height was very likely given the situation. It wasn't particularly high, so I considered it to just be a major injury rather than less likely to be death. But you know, that's a subjective assessment. For this, the collapse of scaffold, again, I considered it to be likely, not very likely. It was possible. It was reasonably well put together in this situation. However, I still considered it to be a major injury. Falling objects, it came to around 6, so I guess it must have been possible. There wasn't much up there, but because they were really small things, then I considered it only to be a minor injury. Again, this is an important part of the assessment, but it's very subjective. But at least it gives you the ability to compare different risks, and it gives you an opportunity to identify areas of significant risk. So then we need to decide on the precautions. Consider the following precautions in the following order. Eliminate, reduce the risk, reduce access, less exposure, so protect the masses, not the individual, and provide training and PPE. You need to consider risk. You need to consider precautions in this order. Obviously, it's important to eliminate a risk where you can rather than just reduce it. PPE is often the last resort, but people sometimes consider it to be the first because it's the easiest to implement. You can see here I've added my list of precautions. And generally, I've tried to consider the principles of prevention as I've showed you in the previous slide, so eliminate rather than reduce, etc., etc. I've used a robotic breaker here, which means that you don't have to go to the area of demolition. That's eliminated the risk. This isn't always possible, but you need to justify it in your risk assessment. Finally, I've added the new risk levels. It's important to remember that with risk levels, it's often the severity that you reduce rather the likelihood, I'm afraid. The severity often stays the same. For example, the likelihood of a scaffold can be reduced by making sure that it's been inspected and properly constructed. However, the severity would remain the same if it collapsed. This is generally the case for most risks. Finally, it's important to implement your findings and make sure that the people are doing the findings that you have identified, and also record it, which you will have done by completing this risk assessment. This is a legal requirement. Finally, you're required to review your findings. This should happen a minimum of every year, but ideally whenever anything changes, i.e. the location of the work or the people that are doing the work or any element of the work, and update the risk assessment accordingly. I hope that this has been of some help to you. Please do feel free to download the risk assessment I've shown you at www.riskwiseconsulting.co.uk. Thanks.